Imagine selling the suit you wore on your wedding day, one of the most precious memories of your life, just to afford your daughter's dream. Now imagine watching that dream destroyed in minutes by someone else's negligence and then being told you're overreacting. This is the story of Michael Patterson, a father who made the ultimate sacrifice, only to face a betrayal so profound it would tear his family apart forever. What happened next will challenge everything you believe about family loyalty, parental responsibility, and the true meaning of justice. This isn't just about a ruined costume. This is about the moment when doing the right thing costs you everything. Michael Patterson grew up in the industrial outskirts of Detroit, Michigan, where factory smokestacks painted the horizon and dreams felt like luxuries reserved for other people. His father worked double shifts at an automotive plant, coming home with oil-stained hands and a back that bent a little more each year. His mother cleaned houses in the wealthy suburbs, returning with stories of lives that seemed impossibly distant from their own cramped two-bedroom apartment on Woodward Avenue. The wedding suit wasn't expensive by conventional standards. Michael bought it from a modest men's store on Grand River Avenue for $350, money he'd saved for 8 months while working as an assistant manager at a hardware store. But that suit represented something far more valuable than its price tag. It was charcoal grey with subtle pinstripes, fitted perfectly to his lean frame, and when he wore it on his wedding day in June of 2012, he felt like he'd finally stepped into the life he'd always imagined. He married Jennifer Chen, a kindergarten teacher he'd met at a community fundraiser, in a small ceremony at a historic church in Midtown Detroit. The reception was held in Jennifer's parents' backyard, with string lights hung between trees and her father grilling chicken and ribs while guests danced to music from a borrowed speaker system. It wasn't glamorous, but it was theirs. And that suit, carefully dry-cleaned and preserved, hung in Michael's closet for years, a tangible reminder that hard work and hope could build something beautiful. Their daughter Emma was born 2 years later. From the moment she could walk, she moved with an unusual grace that Jennifer noticed immediately. At 4 years old, Emma would spin around the living room, her small arms extended, lost in music only she could hear. Jennifer suggested ballet lessons, and Michael, despite their tight budget, agreed. They enrolled Emma at the Detroit City Dance Academy, a modest studio in a converted warehouse where dedicated instructors worked with children from working-class families. Emma wasn't just good at ballet, she was exceptional. By age 7, she was performing solos. By 9, instructors were talking about her potential for professional training. By 11, she'd won regional competitions and earned a reputation as one of the most promising young dancers in the Midwest. But professional ballet demanded more than talent. It required financial resources that the Patterson family simply didn't have. Michael had worked his way up to regional manager at a construction supply company, earning a respectable but modest salary. Jennifer's teaching income helped, but between Emma's lessons, point shoes that wore out every few months, competition fees, and the constant stream of expenses that came with serious ballet training, they were always calculating, always compromising, always worried about whether they could sustain Emma's dreams. When Emma earned the lead role of the Snow Queen in the Detroit City Ballet's production of The Nutcracker, scheduled for December 15th, the family celebrated with cautious joy. This wasn't just another recital. This was a professional production at the Detroit Opera House, with an audience of 2,000 people and scouts from prestigious ballet academies attending specifically to identify emerging talent. For Emma, this performance could open doors to scholarships, training programs, and a legitimate path toward a professional career. Then, they received the costume requirements. The Snow Queen costume needed to be custom-made by a specialist costume designer, hand-stitched, adorned with Swarovski crystals, constructed from imported fabrics, and built to withstand the demands of professional performance while creating the ethereal, glittering effect essential to the role. The cost was $2,200, and it needed to be ordered by October 1st to ensure completion by early December. Michael and Jennifer sat at their kitchen table late into the night, reviewing their finances with growing desperation. They had some savings, but not nearly enough. They'd already stretched their budget to cover the increased training schedule Emma needed for the role. Credit cards were near their limits. A personal loan seemed irresponsible, given their existing obligations. They considered asking Jennifer's parents for help, but her father had recently retired, and they were managing their own financial pressures. Michael looked around their modest ranch-style home in Redford Township, a working-class suburb west of Detroit. They'd bought it 5 years earlier, a small 3-bedroom with a chain-link fence and a yard that needed constant attention. It was filled with furniture they'd accumulated gradually, nothing valuable, nothing they could sell to make a meaningful difference, except for one thing. The wedding suit hung in Michael's closet, still in its preservation garment, untouched since he'd last worn it to his grandfather's funeral 3 years earlier. Jennifer found him standing in front of the closet at 2 in the morning, his hand resting on the garment bag. She knew immediately what he was thinking. She protested quietly, reminding him that the suit meant something, that some things shouldn't be sacrificed. But Michael had already made his decision. He'd built his life on the principle that you protect your children's futures, whatever the cost. The suit was a memory. Emma's opportunity was her future. The choice, painful as it was, felt inevitable. The next morning, Michael took the suit to a consignment shop in Birmingham, an affluent suburb where such items commanded better prices. The owner, a fastidious man in his 60s who examined every stitch with a jeweler's loupe, offered him $400. Michael negotiated to $450. It wasn't nearly enough to cover the costume, but combined with what they could pull together from savings and a temporary hold on other expenses, it would work. Michael returned home without the suit. Jennifer saw his face and didn't ask questions. Emma, oblivious to the sacrifice, was at dance rehearsal, perfecting the fouettes and arabesques that would define her performance. That evening they ordered the costume, providing measurements and confirming the December 1st delivery date. Michael felt the weight of his decision, not regret, but the profound heaviness that comes with giving up a piece of yourself for someone you love. The costume arrived on schedule, delivered in a reinforced box with multiple layers of protective tissue paper. When they opened it, even Michael, who knew nothing about ballet costumes, recognized its extraordinary craftsmanship. The bodice was constructed from white silk, overlaid with silver mesh, hand-embroidered with patterns that caught light like frost on winter windows. Hundreds of Swarovski crystals were individually sewn into the fabric, creating an effect that made the entire costume seem to glow. The tutu was made from layers of stiff tulle, each layer slightly different in length, to create dimension and movement. The entire piece was a work of art. Emma cried when she saw it, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming emotion of seeing her dream made tangible. She tried it on carefully, and it fit perfectly, transforming her from his little girl into something otherworldly, a genuine snow queen who commanded attention and respect. Michael stored the costume in his home office, a converted spare bedroom where he worked remotely 2 days a week. He hung it on a special padded hanger inside a garment bag, away from the household traffic, protected and safe. The performance was 2 weeks away. Everything was ready. Everything was perfect. Michael's relationship with his younger brother David had always been complicated. Growing up, they'd shared a bedroom in that cramped Detroit apartment, their lives intertwined by necessity and circumstance. But where Michael responded to their family's financial struggles with determination and discipline, David developed a different survival strategy: charm, deflection, and an almost willful refusal to accept responsibility for his choices. David was funny, likable, and perpetually optimistic in a way that made people forgive his failures. He dropped out of community college after one semester, drifted through a series of jobs that never quite worked out, and accumulated debts that he discussed with the casual indifference of someone describing bad weather. Their parents, particularly their mother, consistently made excuses for him, providing financial bailouts and emotional support that enabled his patterns rather than challenging them. By his mid-30s, David had 3 children from 2 different relationships, neither of which had resulted in marriage. He lived in Warren, a working-class suburb north of Detroit, in a rental house that always seemed on the verge of chaos. His children, Tyler, age 9, Madison, age 7, and Connor, age 5, were energetic, loud, and poorly supervised. David subscribed to a parenting philosophy he called letting kids be kids, which in practice meant minimal boundaries, inconsistent discipline, and a household where paint, markers, glitter, and craft supplies were always accessible and rarely monitored. Michael loved his nephews and niece but found spending time with them exhausting. David would bring them to family gatherings and immediately disengage, scrolling through his phone while his children ran wild, leaving other adults to manage the chaos. Jennifer had privately expressed concern about inviting them to the house, particularly with Emma's expensive ballet equipment and costumes present, but Michael felt obligated to maintain family connections. The second Saturday of December, exactly 1 week before Emma's performance, their mother organized a family gathering at Michael's house, a casual afternoon barbecue to celebrate the early stages of the holiday season. It wasn't Michael's idea, but refusing would have created family drama he didn't have energy to manage. Jennifer reluctantly agreed, with the strict understanding that Emma's costume was off-limits and secured in the office. David arrived late, as always, with his 3 children tumbling out of his aging SUV like puppies released from a kennel. Tyler immediately began throwing a football in the backyard, with little regard for the windows or the garden Jennifer had carefully maintained. Madison and Connor ran through the house, their voices echoing off walls, their hands already sticky from the juice boxes they'd consumed in the car. The afternoon proceeded with the predictable chaos of a family gathering. Michael's father manned the grill, cooking burgers and hot dogs while sharing stories about the automotive plant where he'd worked for 37 years. Michael's mother fussed over everyone, making sure people had enough food, enough drinks, enough attention. Emma stayed mostly in her room, reviewing choreography notes and stretching, her mind already focused on the upcoming performance. Jennifer helped with food preparation while keeping a watchful eye on the children's movements through the house. David, true to form, planted himself in a lawn chair with a beer, engaging in conversation with whoever passed by, but never quite participating in the actual work of hosting or supervising. When Jennifer quietly suggested he might want to check on his children, he waved dismissively, saying they were fine, they knew how to behave, they were just having fun. Around 3 in the afternoon, Michael was in the backyard, helping his father clean the grill, when he heard Jennifer's voice from inside the house. Not a scream, but something worse, a sharp, breathless sound of shock that carried an unmistakable weight. He dropped the grill brush and ran inside, his heart already pounding with the premonition that something terrible had happened. The door to his office was open. Jennifer stood frozen in the doorway, her hand covering her mouth. Michael pushed past her and stopped, his brain struggling to process what he was seeing. The garment bag lay on the floor, torn open. The Snow Queen costume was spread across his desk, no longer white and silver, but covered in paint. Bright primary colors splashed and smeared across the bodice, the tutu, the delicate embroidered details. Glitter, the cheap craft kind that comes in plastic containers, was everywhere, stuck to the wet paint, scattered across the fabric, ground into the tulle. A container of purple paint had spilled directly onto the crystals, obscuring their sparkle beneath an opaque coating. Tyler, Madison, and Connor stood in the corner of the room, paint on their hands and clothes, glitter in their hair, expressions uncertain but not particularly distressed. They'd found Michael's office during their unsupervised wandering, discovered the garment bag, and decided it would be fun to decorate the pretty costume they'd found. They'd pulled craft supplies from a cabinet where Michael stored materials for work presentations, paint, glitter, markers, and spent perhaps 20 minutes transforming $2,200 and Michael's wedding suit into an unrecognizable mess. Michael couldn't speak. He lifted the costume carefully, watching paint drip onto his desk, feeling the weight of ruined tulle, seeing months of specialized craftsmanship destroyed beyond any possibility of repair. Emma appeared in the doorway behind Jennifer, took one look at the costume, and released a sound Michael would never forget. A keening, anguished cry that came from somewhere deep and primal. Jennifer immediately pulled Emma away, guiding her to the master bedroom, while Michael stood holding the ruined costume, trying to understand how this had happened, how his office door had been opened, how 3 children had been left unsupervised long enough to accomplish this level of destruction. He walked outside, still holding the costume, paint dripping onto the grass. The family gathering had gone silent. His parents stood frozen by the grill. David remained in his lawn chair, beer in hand, taking in the scene with an expression of mild surprise. Michael's voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet and controlled, which made it more terrifying than shouting would have been. He asked David if he saw what his children had done. He explained in simple terms that this costume had cost $2,200, that it was irreplaceable, that Emma's performance was in 1 week, and that David needed to take responsibility for this disaster. David's response was laughter. Not nervous laughter, but genuine amusement at what he apparently considered an overreaction to a minor incident. He said they were just kids. They didn't know better, and besides, it was just a costume. He suggested Michael should have kept it locked up if it was so important. He said Michael was being dramatic and materialistic, and that maybe this was a good lesson for Emma about not being so attached to material things. Michael felt something shift inside him, a fundamental breaking of whatever had held their relationship together, despite years of disappointment and frustration. He told David clearly and explicitly that his children had destroyed something precious, that David's negligence and refusal to supervise them had caused this, and that David owed him $2,200 to replace the costume. David laughed again, shaking his head as if Michael had suggested something absurd. He said there was no way he was paying that much for a dance costume, that Michael was out of his mind if he thought that was reasonable, and that this whole situation was being blown out of proportion. Their mother intervened, her voice taking on the placating tone she'd used throughout their childhood whenever David faced consequences for his actions. She suggested everyone calm down, that they were family, that these things happen, and that surely they could find a solution that didn't involve money or conflict. She looked at Michael with an expression that clearly communicated her expectation that he would be the one to compromise, to forgive, to let it go for the sake of family peace. But Michael didn't let it go. He told David to take his children and leave. He said that until David took responsibility, real, actual responsibility that included financial compensation, they had nothing more to discuss. David stood up, still smiling but with an edge of anger now, and said that Michael had always thought he was better than everyone else, always played the victim, always made everything into a drama. He gathered his children, made a show of leaving with exaggerated offense, and drove away while Michael stood in his driveway, still holding the ruined costume, watching his family gathering dissolve into uncomfortable silence. The aftermath was immediate and devastating. Emma locked herself in her room, her sobs audible through the closed door. Jennifer tried to console her, but there was no consolation available. The performance was in 7 days. The costume had taken 3 months to make. Even if they had the money to order another one, which they absolutely did not, there wasn't time. Michael contacted the costume designer that evening, his voice steady despite the chaos. He explained what had happened and asked if any solution existed. Rush repairs, a substitute costume, anything. The designer's response was sympathetic but definitive. The damage was too extensive. The paint had set into the fabric, the glitter was embedded in the tulle, and the crystals were compromised. Even if repairs were possible, which they weren't, the costume would never look right under stage lights. She could potentially create a new costume, but it would require 3 months of work and the full payment up front. She couldn't help him. Michael called the Detroit City Ballet's production coordinator, hoping for options he hadn't considered. Could Emma perform in a different costume? Could they delay her scenes? Could they find an alternative? The coordinator was kind, but firm. The Snow Queen costume was specific to the role and the production's aesthetic. They had backup costumes for emergencies, but nothing suitable for the lead role. Without the proper costume, Emma couldn't perform. They could offer the role to the understudy, a talented dancer who'd been preparing for exactly this possibility. Emma would lose her role. The performance that could have changed her life, that could have opened doors to scholarships and professional training, was gone. Not because she wasn't talented enough, not because she hadn't worked hard enough, but because David's children had been left unsupervised for 20 minutes. That night, after Emma finally cried herself to sleep, Michael and Jennifer sat in their living room in the dark, too exhausted for words. Jennifer broke the silence first, her voice thick with anger and grief. She said she'd warned him about having David's children in the house. She said this was exactly what she'd feared. She said David had always been irresponsible, and everyone in the family had always made excuses for him, and now their daughter was paying the price. Michael knew she was right. He also knew that blame, while justified, didn't solve their problem. They needed $2,200 and 3 months of specialized work in 7 days. It was impossible. The next day, Sunday, Michael's mother called. She'd spent the night thinking about the situation, and she wanted to talk through solutions as a family. Could Michael and Jennifer come to her house that afternoon for a conversation with David present? Michael agreed, hoping desperately that David had reconsidered, that he'd recognized the severity of what had happened, that some resolution was possible. They sat around his parents' dining room table in the small brick house where Michael and David had grown up. David arrived late, settling into his chair with the casual demeanor of someone attending a mildly inconvenient meeting. Michael's father looked uncomfortable, his weathered hands folded on the table, clearly wishing he could be anywhere else. Michael's mother opened the conversation with her familiar peacemaking approach. She acknowledged that what happened was unfortunate and that everyone felt bad about Emma losing her opportunity. But she also emphasized that family was more important than any costume or performance, and that holding grudges would only hurt everyone involved. She suggested that maybe this was an opportunity for Emma to learn resilience and for the family to remember what really mattered. Michael listened, feeling a cold clarity settle over him. His mother was doing what she'd always done, prioritizing David's comfort over justice, framing consequences as unreasonable, and expecting Michael to absorb the damage for the sake of family harmony. He asked David directly if he intended to pay for the costume. David responded that $2,200 was an insane amount of money for a kid's dance outfit, and that he didn't have that kind of money anyway. He said his kids didn't mean any harm, and that accidents happen, and that Michael needed to accept that instead of trying to punish children for being children. Michael explained, his voice carefully controlled, that this wasn't about punishment. This was about David's responsibility as a parent to supervise his children and to take financial accountability when their actions caused damage. He pointed out that David had brought his children into Michael's home, had failed to watch them, and had created the conditions that led to this disaster. David's response was defensive and angry. He said Michael had always been judgmental, always looked down on him, always acted like he was the perfect brother with the perfect family. He said that maybe, if Michael wasn't so uptight about everything, this wouldn't be such a big deal. He said Emma could dance in another costume or in a different show, and that it wasn't the end of the world. Jennifer, who'd remained silent until this point, spoke up. Her voice was quiet but intense, carrying a rage that Michael had rarely heard from her. She explained what this performance meant for Emma's future, how scouts from ballet academies were attending specifically to see her, how this opportunity could have led to scholarships worth tens of thousands of dollars. She explained that Michael had sold his wedding suit to afford the costume, a sacrifice that David apparently couldn't comprehend or appreciate. She said that David's refusal to take responsibility was teaching his own children that actions don't have consequences, and that other people would always clean up their messes. David stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. He said he wasn't going to sit there and be lectured by people who thought they were better than him. He said his kids were more important than any stupid dance costume, and that if Michael and Jennifer couldn't understand that, then maybe they needed to re-evaluate their priorities. He walked out, the door slamming behind him, leaving silence in his wake. Michael's mother immediately turned to Michael with tears in her eyes, saying he couldn't let this tear the family apart, that David was proud and needed time, and that pushing him would only make things worse. She asked Michael to please consider forgiving the debt and finding another way forward. Michael stood up slowly, looking at his mother, then at his father, who'd remained silent throughout the entire conversation. He said that David had always been given passes for his behavior, had always been protected from consequences, and that this pattern had enabled him to become a man who could watch a child's dreams destroyed and feel nothing but annoyance at being asked to take responsibility. He said that forgiving this debt would teach David that he could damage other people's lives without penalty, and would teach his own children the same lesson. Michael's father finally spoke, his voice rough from years of factory work and cigarettes. He said that Michael was right, that David needed to pay, but that $2,200 might as well be $22,000 for David's financial situation. He offered to pay half if Michael would accept that as resolution. Michael appreciated the offer but declined. This wasn't about the money being recovered. This was about David acknowledging what his negligence had cost and choosing to make it right. Accepting their father's money would just be another way of protecting David from consequences. He and Jennifer left, driving home in silence, both understanding that something fundamental had broken in the family structure that afternoon. By Monday morning, Michael's phone was flooded with messages from family members. His mother had apparently spent Sunday evening calling relatives, providing her version of events, a version in which Michael was being unreasonable and vindictive, punishing innocent children for an accident, and destroying family unity over material possessions. Cousins, aunts, uncles, and family friends reached out with messages ranging from concerned to accusatory. Several suggested he was overreacting. A few offered unsolicited advice about forgiveness and perspective. One cousin sent a long message about the importance of family bonds being more valuable than money. His mother's sister called to say she was disappointed in how Michael was handling this, and that his grandfather would have been ashamed of him for treating his brother this way. The narrative David and Michael's mother had constructed was spreading efficiently through their family network, and in this version, Michael was the villain, a cold, materialistic man who cared more about money than family, who was willing to destroy relationships over a costume, who couldn't forgive children for being children. Only a handful of people reached out with support. Jennifer's parents called immediately, offering to loan whatever money they could pull together. Emma's ballet instructor sent a message expressing outrage at what had happened and offering to advocate with the production coordinators for any possible solutions. Michael's closest friend from high school called to say the situation was absolute nonsense and that David deserved to face real consequences, but the prevailing family narrative was clear. Michael needed to let this go. On Wednesday, 4 days before the performance, Emma's ballet instructor called with unexpected news. She'd spoken to several other instructors and parents at the academy, explaining Emma's situation. The story had resonated deeply with people who understood the financial sacrifices families made for serious ballet training and the devastating impact of losing a performance opportunity at this level. A group of parents had organized a fundraising effort, pulling together donations to help replace the costume. They'd raised $800. It was generous and meaningful, but it wasn't nearly enough, and there still wasn't time to commission a new costume. That evening, Michael made a decision that would change everything. He wrote a detailed account of what had happened and posted it on his personal social media accounts, Facebook, Twitter, and a local Detroit community forum. He wasn't trying to go viral or create drama. He was simply exhausted from defending himself against a false narrative and wanted the truth documented clearly. He wrote about selling his wedding suit to afford the costume. He described the costume's significance for Emma's future. He explained exactly what David's children had done and David's subsequent refusal to take any responsibility. He included photos of the ruined costume, the paint and glitter covering what had been a work of art. He was careful not to attack David personally, but focused on the facts of the situation and the impossible position it had created for his daughter. He posted it late Wednesday night and went to bed, expecting perhaps a few friends would read it and offer support. He woke up Thursday morning to discover his phone overwhelmed with notifications. The post had been shared hundreds of times. By Thursday afternoon, it had been shared thousands of times. Local news outlets had picked up the story. By Friday morning, it had gone viral nationally, shared across parenting forums, dance communities, and social justice platforms. The public response was overwhelming. Strangers from around the country offered donations through various platforms. Ballet companies from Detroit, Chicago, and New York reached out with offers of costume assistance. Professional costume designers contacted Michael saying they'd work through the weekend to create something Emma could wear. The story resonated because it touched on themes everyone understood: parental sacrifice, family betrayal, the frustration of watching irresponsible people escape consequences. Within 48 hours, strangers had donated over $12,000. A professional costume designer from New York, moved by Emma's story, offered to create a rush costume using a modified design from a previous production she'd worked on, incorporating elements that would work for the Snow Queen role. She'd work non-stop from Friday through Monday, and if Michael could get Emma to New York for a Sunday fitting, the costume would be ready for Tuesday's dress rehearsal. It was a miracle assembled by strangers who'd never met Emma, but understood the value of protecting a child's dreams from senseless destruction. But the viral attention brought other consequences. David's name wasn't in Michael's original post, but family members and friends quickly identified him in comments and shares. His employer, a logistics company, saw the story and the public backlash. They placed David on administrative leave while reviewing whether his demonstrated negligence in his personal life raised concerns about his judgment in his professional responsibilities. His landlord, seeing the viral story and David's name associated with it, expressed concerns about whether David's supervision of his children met lease requirements regarding property safety. David's phone number, despite Michael never sharing it, somehow ended up on internet forums. He received hundreds of angry calls and messages from strangers berating him for his irresponsibility and his treatment of his niece. His social media accounts were flooded with comments. Someone created a satirical crowdfunding page titled "Help David Learn Responsibility" that was shared thousands of times. Michael's mother called him Friday afternoon, her voice shaking with anger and tears. She said he'd destroyed David's life, that he'd intentionally weaponized the internet against his own brother, that he'd gone too far in pursuit of revenge. She said David was facing consequences at work, that he was being harassed constantly, that his children were confused and upset by the negative attention. Michael listened to her accusations and felt a complicated mix of emotions. He hadn't wanted David to be harassed or to lose his job. He'd simply told the truth about what happened. But he also recognized that David was finally facing real consequences for his actions, not because Michael had orchestrated some elaborate revenge, but because David's behavior, when exposed to public scrutiny, was indefensible. He told his mother that he was sorry David was being harassed, that he didn't condone threats or abuse, but that he wouldn't apologize for telling the truth about what happened. He said that if David had taken responsibility immediately, none of this would have been necessary. He said that maybe, finally, David would understand that actions have consequences. His mother said she didn't know if she could forgive Michael for this. Then she hung up. Emma performed as the Snow Queen on Tuesday, December 15th at the Detroit Opera House. The costume created by the New York designer wasn't identical to the original, but it was beautiful and appropriate, featuring a slightly different crystal pattern and a modified color scheme that still captured the ethereal quality essential to the role. The performance was extraordinary. Emma danced with a fierce determination that seemed to channel all the pain and struggle of the previous 2 weeks into something transcendent. Her fouettes were precise and powerful. Her arabesques held perfect lines. Her emotional interpretation of the Snow Queen's cold majesty and eventual warmth brought depth that judges and scouts noted in their evaluations. The audience gave her a standing ovation that lasted nearly 5 minutes. Scouts from 3 major ballet academies approached Michael and Jennifer after the performance, expressing interest in Emma for summer intensive programs and potential scholarship opportunities. The head of the Detroit City Ballet told them Emma had a genuine future in professional dance if she continued on this trajectory. It was everything they'd hoped for, everything Michael had sacrificed his wedding suit to make possible. Emma's dreams were intact, her future was bright, the disaster had been averted. But the cost was steep. David lost his job at the logistics company. The official reason was restructuring, but everyone understood the real cause. The viral attention and public backlash had made him a liability. He found new employment eventually, but at reduced pay and without the benefits his previous position had offered. His relationship with Michael's parents became strained as they navigated between supporting both sons, while recognizing that David's behavior had indeed been indefensible. Michael's mother never fully forgave Michael for making the situation public, viewing it as a betrayal of family privacy regardless of the circumstances. Michael's extended family remained divided. Some relatives understood why Michael had done what he did and respected him for standing up for his daughter. Others felt he'd gone too far, that family should be protected even when they're wrong, and that public humiliation was never justified regardless of provocation. Michael and David didn't speak for 8 months. Their first interaction came at their father's 70th birthday party, where they exchanged awkward pleasantries but avoided any substantive conversation. The easy brotherhood of their childhood and young adulthood was gone, replaced by a formal distance that suggested the wound was too deep to heal. In March, 5 months after the costume incident, Michael received an unexpected package at his home. Inside was a check for $2,200 and a handwritten letter from David. The letter was brief and carefully worded. David wrote that he'd spent the past months thinking about what happened, about his role in it, and about the consequences his negligence had caused. He wrote that he'd been wrong to dismiss the situation as unimportant, wrong to refuse responsibility, and wrong to put his pride ahead of doing the right thing. He wrote that he was working with a therapist to understand his patterns of avoiding accountability, and that he was trying to be a better parent and a better person. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't ask to rebuild their relationship. He simply said he was sorry, that Michael had been right, and that this payment was long overdue. Michael stood in his driveway holding the check and the letter, feeling emotions he couldn't fully articulate. The money didn't undo the damage. The apology didn't erase the pain Emma had experienced or the family fracture that had resulted, but it represented something he'd never expected to receive: David's acknowledgement that he'd been wrong. He called David that evening. The conversation was brief and awkward, but genuine. Michael thanked him for the payment and the letter. David said he hoped eventually they could find a way to rebuild something between them, but that he understood if Michael needed time. Michael said he appreciated that and suggested maybe they could get coffee in a few weeks, just the two of them, and talk. They did meet for coffee, and then again a month later, and gradually, carefully, they began rebuilding a relationship that looked nothing like what they'd had before, but was perhaps more honest and more sustainable. Emma continued to excel in ballet. She attended a summer intensive program at a prestigious academy in New York, where she thrived and grew as a dancer. She earned a partial scholarship for the following year, reducing the financial burden on Michael and Jennifer significantly. The viral story eventually faded from public attention, replaced by newer dramas and outrages. The thousands of strangers who donated to Emma's costume fund moved on to other causes and concerns. But within the ballet community, particularly among families who understood the sacrifices required to pursue serious dance training, Emma's story became a touchstone, a reminder of how fragile these opportunities can be and how important it is to protect them. Michael never replaced his wedding suit. The money from David's payment went into Emma's ballet training fund, where it served a more immediate and practical purpose. Sometimes he thought about the suit, about what it had represented, about the choice he'd made to sell it. He didn't regret the decision, but he mourned what was lost, not the suit itself, but the innocence of believing that family would always protect each other, that doing the right thing would always be rewarded, that sacrifice would always be honored. Jennifer sometimes asked if he wished things had gone differently, if he wished he'd handled the situation another way. Michael's answer was always the same. He wished David had taken responsibility immediately, that the family had supported justice instead of enabling dysfunction, that Emma had never had to experience that pain. But given the choices he'd actually faced, he wouldn't change what he'd done. Emma performed the following year in the Nutcracker again, this time as Clara, in a costume they could afford without sacrifice. Michael and Jennifer sat in the audience, watching their daughter dance, knowing that her talent and her opportunities were the result of years of sacrifice and difficult choices. After the performance, Emma found them backstage, still in costume, glowing with joy and accomplishment. She hugged them both and thanked them for everything they'd done to make her dreams possible. She said she understood now what the costume had cost, what Michael had given up, and that she would never take any of it for granted. Michael held his daughter and felt the complicated weight of parenthood, the joy of seeing your child succeed, the pain of protecting them from a world that doesn't always care, the exhausting necessity of making impossible choices and living with their consequences. He thought about the wedding suit hanging in his closet for all those years, a symbol of hope and new beginnings. Then he thought about Emma in her Snow Queen costume, transformed into something magical and powerful. And he understood that sometimes the most meaningful symbols aren't the ones we preserve, but the ones we're willing to sacrifice for something greater. The relationship between sacrifice and love, between justice and family, between forgiveness and accountability, These weren't simple equations with clear answers. Michael had learned that doing the right thing doesn't always feel good, that protecting your child sometimes means accepting permanent damage to other relationships, and that sometimes the people who should support you will be the ones who ask you to accept injustice for the sake of peace. Years later, when Emma was accepted into a prestigious ballet company's apprentice program, Michael attended her first professional performance. She danced the lead in a contemporary piece that explored themes of transformation and resilience. Watching her command the stage with confidence and artistry, he thought about that December week when everything had fallen apart and somehow been rebuilt by the kindness of strangers and the determination to protect what mattered most. David attended that performance too, sitting several rows behind Michael and Jennifer with his children, who were older now and noticeably more supervised. After the show, the brothers spoke briefly, their conversation still marked by a formality that suggested some wounds never fully heal. But there was respect there too, earned through years of difficult honesty and slow rebuilding. Emma's career continued to flourish, built on talent, dedication, and a foundation of sacrifices, both large and small. The costume incident became a story she told sometimes, usually to younger dancers facing their own challenges and setbacks, as a reminder that obstacles can be overcome, and that having people willing to fight for your dreams makes all the difference. Michael eventually bought another suit for formal occasions, a practical navy blue from a department store that cost a fraction of what the wedding suit had. It served its purpose adequately, but it never meant what that charcoal grey suit with subtle pinstripes had meant. Some things, once sacrificed, can never truly be replaced, but their absence can create space for something else. In this case, a daughter's dreams fulfilled and a father's understanding of what truly matters. The story doesn't have a neat ending because life rarely does. Families remain complicated. Consequences ripple outward in ways that can't always be controlled. Justice, when it comes, often arrives alongside collateral damage that no one wanted. But some truths remain constant. Children deserve parents who will protect their dreams. Actions deserve consequences. And sometimes the hardest thing and the right thing are exactly the same. Michael Patterson's story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions that don't have easy answers. When family betrays you, how far should you go to seek justice? When forgiveness enables bad behavior, is it still a virtue? How do we balance the desire for family harmony with the need to protect our children from those who refuse to take responsibility for their actions? This wasn't a story about a ruined costume. It was a story about the price of doing what's right when everyone around you is asking you to accept what's wrong. It was about a father who understood that protecting his daughter's future mattered more than maintaining comfortable lies about family loyalty. It was about the moment when sacrifice stops being noble and starts being exploitation, and the courage required to say no. What would you have done in Michael's position? Would you have accepted your parents' pleas for peace and absorbed the loss to keep the family together? Would you have taken your father's offer to split the cost, allowing your brother to escape accountability once again? Or would you have done what Michael did, stood firm on principle, even when it cost you relationships that had defined your entire life? More importantly, what does this story tell us about our own families, our own patterns of enabling dysfunction to avoid conflict, our own tendencies to ask victims to be understanding while never demanding that wrongdoers take responsibility? These are not easy questions, and your answers matter. Share your perspective in the comments below. Tell us about times when you faced similar choices, when doing the right thing cost you something precious, when family loyalty conflicted with justice. Your experiences and insights contribute to a larger conversation about how we navigate these impossible situations. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think or feel or question your own assumptions about family and responsibility, please subscribe to our channel. We bring you true stories that explore the complicated realities of human relationships, the moral dilemmas we all face, and the moments that define who we are and what we stand for. Your subscription ensures we can continue creating content that matters, that challenges, that reflects the messy truth of real life. And when you're finished here, watch our next recommended video, where we explore another family torn apart by a single decision, a story about inheritance, betrayal, and the question of whether we owe loyalty to people simply because they're family, or whether loyalty must be earned through actions and character. Thank you for watching. Thank you for engaging with these difficult questions. And thank you for understanding that sometimes the most important stories are the ones that don't offer easy answers, but instead ask us to examine our own beliefs about justice, sacrifice, and what we owe to the people we love.